This talk is called The Universal Theory of Switching, with co-authors Bradley Alicea, Daniela Cialfi, Ankit Grover, and Jesse Parent. When we talk about switching, we have to talk about the concept of the switch itself. And a switch is essentially a zeroth order cybernetic system. So when we think of cybernetics, we think of exquisite regulation and control, but in this case we just mean that there's a switch between two binary states and that it exists in time as a system. So we have on the left, we have a light switch where you just turn the state of the light on and off. In the middle, you have a Heaviside step function, which produces a binary output in a neural network, but it's essentially a very abrupt transition between two states. And then finally on the right, we have this first order phase transition example of a liquid turning to a solid state in nitrogen gas. And so you can see it's a very abrupt transition that's global. So we can turn to the single cell example. Actually, it's an example from bacterial nanomotors. And we can look at the growth rate of the bacteria depending on the carbon source. So in these environments, which are continuous from poor to rich carbon, we see the behavioral response. And the behavioral response is quite different from the actual gradient of carbon resources. So when we have poor resources, the growth rate is stable. When you get to a certain point in terms of carbon concentration, there's this upshift phase, which shifts the growth rate to this logarithmic phase. And then you see this a lot in rich carbon sources. The point here is that there's this point where the system transitions quite suddenly to a new state. Now that brings us to an idea called bistability. So bistability involves switching between two states. And so in this case, we look at epigenetic switching, which you see often in genomes in single cells or in organisms where that cell needs to move from one state to another. And so the epigenetic switch is poised so that it can go from one state to another, and it has control over a number of genes that allow it to do this. But in this case of bistability, you have this ball number 3 that's poised on this peak, and then it falls either into well 1 or well 2, which are, of course, the stable states. Now, this graph on the y-axis says potential energy, but that measure could be anything. And so bistability is just the ability to move between states and be poised at sort of a midpoint that allows it to shift one way or another. So that brings us to looking at this in terms of algorithms, not just in terms of biology. And in algorithmic switching, which is something our co-author Ankit Grover developed using this FLISCOPT platform, or the flight scheduling optimization platform, he's looking at using genetic algorithms to capture the switching phenomena and using it as a criterion to improve performance on the algorithm. So you can see that you're basically taking a genetic algorithm and you're switching the minimax objective between two alternate algorithms at some interval. It could be regular, it could be random. And the idea is to enhance performance. And so the way this is done is by pushing the algorithm towards new domains. So it allows the algorithm to escape from local minima. So in this graph, you don't really see an improvement in performance. You see how the algorithm is reversed at every 200 generations. And if we're on a smooth fitness landscape right now, but if we were on a rough fitness landscape, we would see improvements in performance or a decrease in the objective function score over a number of generations. So this reversal would have more of an effect. And this is a sketch of the algorithm. Basically, you start with algorithm 1, you introduce a mutation, which then flips to a new reversed algorithm, and that reversed algorithm allows the system to explore engage in multiple local searches of the fitness landscape. It stands in as a substitute for gradient descent and allows us to find a global minimum much more effectively. Now we move back to attention and maybe biological and behavioral systems, and we have this concept called attentional switching. And we see this in cognitive psychology a lot, but we also find it in machine learning and robotics. And this results from the adaptive switching between two alternate tasks, in this case, two different patterns that this agent is looking at. And so we assume centralized control through things like the central executive, but switching from one task to another requires time to refocus. So there's a cost associated with the switching. And if these switches occur too closely in time, it can be very costly to the agent. So we want to look at ways to decrease this cost. We want to look at the structure of the control mechanism, especially in agents that drive this response. And so we can, we typically think of this biologically as a serial system, but it could be configured as a parallel system, a set of parallel autonomous processes. And then agents, you can manipulate this design to decrease the switching cost and to really probe the switching mechanism quite a bit. Now we turn to one of our other co-authors, Bradley Alicea, and an archive paper that he produced called Naturally Supervised Learning and Manipulable Technologies. And this is an approach that uses this learning, unlearning, and relearning paradigm it goes back to motor learning, and it allows us to look at different types of environments that might have an effect on performance in a mixed reality environment. So the physics of the environment, forces, light, surfaces, act to supervise the nervous system in terms of plasticity and learning. When these cues are removed in this the virtual component of this environment, it creates a cognitive gap. And these cognitive gaps can be enhanced or overcome adaptively through applying this experimental design. So this experimental design was applied on a force feedback device, and we were able to record muscle on this and get different responses for different types of surfaces. So these are traces of EMG traces these are actually measures of EMG traces based on the force feedback for each of these surfaces. And as you can see, the surfaces are different. The simulated surfaces, in fact, are different. And so that leads us to a different pattern of trace. And then we can do this with in a golf game, in a golf simulation, where we do this switching. We have people forget about what they've learned and then relearn it over a period of sequential trials, and we observe these types of responses. So we can observe a lot of different patterns of relearning and other types of adaptive behavior. Another way to think about this is in terms of active inference. So what happens to the brain when we update our internal beliefs? We can switch between different beliefs, and this switches us to a new mode of learning. We can also do the switching between learning, unlearning, and relearning, and this has effects on action selection, which is a form of attentional switching. So thank you for your attention, and this is our lab, orthogonal research and education lab, and if you have any questions, contact